Okay, let's unpack this. Today we're diving into something that, well, it really impacts the very fabric of urban life in Bengaluru. We're talking about the detailed rules and regulations governing how buildings are constructed, managed, and even how unauthorized structures are handled. Our mission with this deep dive is really to cut through all the legal jargon, the complex details, and bring out what's most important, maybe surprising, and definitely relevant for you. We want to help you understand not just what these rules are, but, why they actually matter for the city's future.
And what's particularly insightful here, I think, is just how comprehensive these regulations aim to be. They're really designed for structured, transparent, and crucially enforceable urban development. So we'll be exploring the nuts and bolts, the details, but also that bigger picture. Why does this matter if you live in Bengaluru or are just interested in the city? Our core sources for this, just so you know, are specific excerpts from the Bengaluru Building Regulations, Compliance, Enforcement, and Regularization document, plus detailed discussions on the legal framework, the bylaws, fees, enforcement, the whole package.
Right. So if this is a major overhaul, what's the new big picture legal framework? What's the main act we should be looking at?
Yeah, that's a great starting point. The foundational shift is the Greater Bengaluru Governance Act 2024. This is the new umbrella law, basically. It supersedes previous acts. And it's a huge deal because it mandates the city corporations, the BBMP, essentially to create their own specific building bylaws. That gives them significant power. It also sets up the Greater Bengaluru Authority, the GBA. Their role is key in coordinating development and preparing what they call model building bylaws.
Model bylaws, so like a template.
Exactly. For uniform application across the whole metro area, the idea is a more consolidated, coordinated approach to urban planning rather than fragmented rules.
Okay, that makes sense. So we have this big framework, the GBA coordinating. What do these detailed bylaws actually cover then? Are we talking broad strokes, or do they really get into the nitty-gritty?
Oh, they get into every nitty-gritty detail you can possibly imagine. Seriously, if you connect this to the bigger picture, these aren't just suggestions, they're incredibly specific. They dictate everything from, the detailed submission requirements for your building plans, site plans, floor plans, elevations, sections, all that, right down to the very type of site where construction is even permitted in the first place.
Wow, okay. That is thorough. Give us some examples of those specific requirements. What kind of details are we talking about?
Absolutely. So beyond just the technical standards for the actual construction, they identify prohibited locations where you just can't build. They even dictate building height relative to the width of the street it's on. They delve into the specifics of foundations, the lowest floor levels. And crucially, they mandate things like sufficient open space, ventilation, and even secondary access points specifically for waste removal. That's quite specific.
Yeah, that's a level of detail you might not expect, right? And it continues. They specify materials for walls, roofs, floors, essentials like staircases, drains. But it's not just the basics. They mandate modern necessities and safety features. Things like lifts, ramps, facilities for differently abled persons, and very specific fire protection requirements, including detailed fire plans. That's a huge focus.
And you mentioned forward-looking aspects.
Exactly. What's fascinating is that layer. You'll find provisions for minimum plantation requirements, actual greenery mandates. Rainwater harvesting systems are in there, provisions for renewable energy applications, minimum quality standards for materials, and even things like EV charging infrastructure and ensuring telecom services can be easily installed. It's meant to be a comprehensive blueprint for how Bengaluru builds its future, really.
Okay, so we've got the framework, the super detailed bylaws. But how do you actually get permission to build within this system? It sounds like more than just drawing up plans. There's this whole maze of applications, certificates. How does that work now?
Precisely. It starts, as you might expect, with a written application to the commissioner. This needs to come with all the detailed plans and documents laid out in the bylaws. The approval process involves the commissioner, who gets advice from the additional chief town planner. They verify if everything conforms to the rules. Now, the system is designed, or at least intended, for efficiency. The commissioner has a tight 30-day deadline for that initial approval.
30 days? That sounds ambitious for government processes. Does that actually happen? Are there ways to, push it along?
Well, it's definitely an improvement on paper. But here's the interesting part for applicants, the real leverage. If the commissioner misses that 30-day deadline, the applicant can formally request a decision. That triggers a 15-day extension. And if there's still no decision after that, it goes up the chain. The GBA chief commissioner gets another month to decide, and if they don't decide within that month, your permission is automatically considered granted if your plans actually align with the act and the bylaws, of course.
Ah, so it's deemed granted. That puts the pressure back on the authorities.
It really does. It puts the onus firmly on them to act. And once you get that sanction, the plan is valid for 5 years. That gives builders a clear window. And one more crucial power the commissioner has. They can order an immediate stop to any construction that's seen as endangering public health, human life, or safety.
Right. Immediate safety concerns override everything. Okay, so you get the initial permission. What about checks during the build and after? It's not just a one-time approval, is it?
Not at all. Beyond that initial sanction, there are 2 really key certificates you need to be aware of. First, there's something called the Plinth certificate. This is required once you've actually built up to the plinth level, the base of your building. It's issued after a physical check by the commissioner or their team, usually within 15 days, assuming everything matches the plan so far.
Okay, Plinth certificate first, and then the big one, the occupancy certificate, or OC, right? That's the one everyone talks about. That makes it legal to actually live or work there.
Precisely. Yeah. For anyone who's dealt with property in Bengaluru, the OC is often that final, sometimes nerve-wracking hurdle. This is required after the construction is fully complete. An empaneled architect or engineer has to apply for it within 30 days of completion. Now, an OC is granted if the building conforms to the sanctioned plans, or if any deviations are within what they call condonable limits.
Condonable limits. What does that mean exactly? A little bit of wiggle room.
Sort of. It's a practical allowance. The regulations seem to understand that minor deviations can happen during a complex construction project. So if your building is just slightly off, say, a minor setback difference, and it's within a specific limit, usually not more than 10% of the permissible limit for that element, then it could be condoned, basically forgiven, provided you pay what's called a compounding fee.
Ah, so you pay a penalty to legalize that small deviation?
Exactly. Think of it like a fine that allows you to avoid demolishing something over a minor, non-critical issue. It avoids disproportionate consequences. But the really crucial thing about the OC, and this is key for anyone buying or renting, occupation without an OC is generally prohibited. And critically, utility service providers, electricity, water, sewage, cannot give you permanent connections without seeing that OC.
Wow. Okay, so no OC, no lights, no water. That's a serious enforcement tool.
It's probably one of the most effective ones, realistically. And the commissioner also has the power to withdraw, suspend, or even cancel an OC later if breaches are found.
Got it. So the OC is absolutely non-negotiable for actually using the building. What about other specific requirements you mentioned earlier, like rainwater harvesting or dealing with road widening? Are those checked for the OC too?
Good points. Yes, those are often tied in. The regulations reinforce things like rainwater harvesting, which is mandated by the separate Bengaluru Water Supply and Sewerage Act from way back in 1964. That's vital for a water-stressed city like Bengaluru. And for situations like road widening or relinquishment, if your plot boundary falls within an area marked for future road widening in the master plan, you have to surrender that land. But here's the interesting bit, the trade-off. You might be eligible for twice the surrendered area in extra floor area ratio, or FAR, on your remaining plot.
So you give up land, but you get rights to build higher or denser on what's left.
Exactly. It's often offered instead of just cash compensation. It incentivizes cooperation with the master plan. Similarly, if your building is at a street corner, you might be required to round off or splay the corner for better traffic visibility and public convenience. And again, the owner is typically entitled to an FAR benefit for that surrendered triangular bit of land. It's about making public improvements less painful for property owners.
Okay, that makes sense. Now, let's shift gears a bit and talk money. Building in Bengaluru clearly involves paying various fees and charges. How are these set, and what are the main ones people need to budget for?
Right, the financial side. These fees aren't just pulled out of thin air. They're generally linked to the guidance value of the land. That's the government's official benchmark property price for that specific area, determined under the Karnataka Stamp Act. Using guidance value aims for fairness and prevents people under-declaring property values to pay lower fees. A key takeaway on the fees is that they're often tiered. Non-residential projects usually pay a higher percentage than residential ones, sometimes double.
Okay, tiered fees. Can you give us a rough idea of the ranges for some of these key fees? What are we talking about percentage-wise?
Sure. For instance, the initial license fee can be up to 0.20% of the vacant site's guidance value for residential and up to 0.30% for non-residential. Then there's an infrastructure and environment impact fee. This is meant to cover costs related to public roads, general infrastructure, managing construction debris, that sort of thing. That can be up to 0.10% for residential and 0.25% for non-residential. There's also a fee specifically for getting that Plinth certificate we discussed, maybe around 0.15% for residential, 0.20% for non-residential. And a scrutiny fee for processing various certificates, perhaps up to 0.10% residential, 0.20% non-residential. On top of those, there might be development charges, especially for taller residential buildings, say over 14 meters, or for any non-residential building. These depend on location, use, and the total sanctioned built-up area. And finally, there's usually a security deposit required up front. The idea is to ensure you stick to the sanction plan. If you deviate significantly, this deposit might be forfeited.
So quite a few different fees adding up. Are there any exemptions?
Yes, there are some standard exemptions. Typically, constructions by the central or state government themselves don't require these license or permission fees. And things like BMTC bus stops, provided they have choir government sanction, are also usually exempt.
Okay, so we've covered the standard fees for playing by the rules. But what happens financially when things go wrong? What about those deviations or non-compliance? You mentioned compounding fees.
Right. The financial consequences for not following the rules can be quite significant, acting as a strong deterrent. For example, that compounding fee for not getting a Plinth certificate on time can be up to 0.15% residential or 0.25% non-residential of the site's guidance value. And for condoning deviated construction within those permissible limits, that 10% wiggle room we talked about for the OC, the compounding fees are much higher. We're talking up to 15% of the vacant site's guidance value for residential and up to 25% for non-residential. That's a serious chunk of money.
15 or 25%. Okay, that's definitely more than just a slap on the wrist.
Absolutely. And beyond compounding fees, there can be straightforward fines for non-compliance. For instance, if you fail to comply with an official notice ordering you to alter or demolish an unauthorized part, the fine could be up to 20% of the guidance value of the entire site and building. And if the commissioner ultimately has to step in and carry out the demolition themselves because the owner refused, all those demolition costs are recovered directly from the owner. They're treated like property tax arrears, so the government has strong mechanisms to get that money back.
That's a clear financial stick. Now, let's tackle the really big issue. Unauthorized construction. This has been, let's face it, a persistent problem in Bengaluru for years. How do these new regulations really try to tackle it? What's the enforcement process look like?
Yeah, this is definitely a core focus. Unauthorized construction, or significant deviations from sanctioned plans, are explicitly called continuing violations in the regulations. That wording itself signals their serious nature. The enforcement process laid out is quite structured. First, the commissioner or an authorized officer inspects the site. If they observe what appears to be unauthorized construction, a formal notice is served on the owner. This usually calls for a joint inspection and asks the owner to submit all relevant documents. If, after inspection, the unauthorized construction is confirmed, a provisional demolition or alteration order is issued. The owner then gets a minimum of 15 days. It has to be at least that to provide a written justification, essentially to show cause why the order shouldn't be confirmed. They usually get a chance for a personal hearing, too.
Okay, so there's a due process element.
Yes, there is. But if no sufficient cause is presented, or the justification isn't accepted after the hearing, the demolition order is confirmed. And if the owner still doesn't comply, that can lead to a criminal complaint being filed. And as we mentioned, the commissioner can proceed with a demolition anyway, recovering the costs from the owner as property tax arrears. The commissioner also has the power to actually seal unlawful erections or entire premises. This can be done to prevent the illegal structure from being used or simply to make demolition easier. And separately, any existing permissions can be suspended or revoked if the conditions aren't met, if taxes aren't paid, or importantly, if it turns out the permission was obtained through misrepresentation or fraud.
So it sounds like the responsibility lies squarely with the owner, but is it only the owner on the hook here? What about others involved, like promoters or even banks?
That's where these regulations get really interesting and potentially quite impactful. What's striking is how clearly they allocate responsibility beyond just the owner. Yes, building owners and promoters are held fully responsible for ensuring everything adheres to the sanctioned plans. No ambiguity there. And if violations go beyond those condonable limits, meaning they're too big to be regularized through fees, they must be demolished at the owner's expense, period. But here's the part that could be a real game changer. Financial institutions, banks, Housing finance companies are explicitly prohibited from providing loans for constructions that violate sanctioned plans.
Whoa, okay. Banks can't lend if the plans aren't being followed.
Exactly. Think about the implications. The risk suddenly isn't just on the individual builder anymore. It effectively pulls financial institutions into the compliance net. Lenders now have a strong incentive to scrutinize projects much more closely, maybe even conduct their own checks to ensure compliance before and during disbursement. They essentially become de facto enforcement agents protecting their own investment. This could fundamentally change how projects are vetted and funded in Bengaluru. It creates a powerful ripple effect.
That is a massive shift, turning lenders into watchdogs. Anyone else liable?
Yes. The regulations also state that the jurisdictional officers, the government officials responsible for that area who fail to prevent unauthorized deviations, can also be held liable for punishment. So it's really trying to create accountability at multiple levels: owner, promoter, financier, and the officials themselves. It's a multi-pronged approach.
Okay, that's a strong stance on new and ongoing construction. But what about all the existing structures? Buildings that were put up unlawfully before these new regulations came into force? Is there any chance for them to be sort of brought into the legal fold, regularized?
That's a really critical question given Bengaluru's history. And yes, the Act does allow for the regularization of certain unlawful buildings, but, and this is a big but, it's only for buildings constructed at least 1 year before this new Act was officially notified. It's not an open door for recent violations, and it comes with very strict limits. It's a practical concession, maybe, but definitely not a free-for-all.
Right. So what exactly can be regularized under this limited window, and what are the definite no-goes? What are the hard lines?
This is where it gets quite nuanced. The condonable limits for regularization are actually a bit more generous than for ongoing construction deviations. We're talking about potentially regularizing violations up to 25% for non-residential buildings and up to 50% for residential buildings, specifically concerning things like setbacks from property lines or building lines. To achieve this, owners might be able to utilize things like premium floor area ratio, FAR, or development rights certificates, DRCs, potentially buying extra rights to cover the deviation.
DRCs, what are those exactly?
Right, development rights certificates. These are often given, for example, when someone surrenders land for public benefit, like road widening. They're essentially transferable building rights. You could use that certificate to build extra floor area on another plot you own, or even sell the certificate to another developer. It's a way to compensate landowners with development potential instead of just cash. So you might be able to use purchased DRCs to help regularize certain FAR violations within limits.
Okay, so some flexibility on setbacks and FAR for older buildings, but what absolutely cannot be regularized no matter what?
This is crucial to understand. There are hard lines. For example, basement development or usage that fundamentally contravenes the bylaws, say, an illegally converted commercial basement that's generally not regularizable. And buildings that violate established building lines, maybe encroaching too close to the road, they might only be regularized if the owner gives a formal undertaking, a legal promise, to surrender that encroaching land for road widening whenever the authorities require it in the future. No compensation for that bit later.
So you get temporary relief, but you might lose that land later.
Potentially, yes. The overall regularization process itself, the application and how it's handled, generally follows the procedures laid out in the older Karnataka Town and Country Planning Act of 1961. There are fees, of course, significant ones. The regularization fees vary depending on the extent and type of violation. They can range anywhere from 6% up to maybe 35% of the market value of the specific violated portion of the building. Non-residential buildings typically face higher percentage rates than residential ones.
Okay, so it's not cheap to regularize. Where does all that fee money go?
That's specified too. The funds collected from these regularization fees are supposed to be credited to a dedicated account called the Urban Areas Infrastructure Development Fund. And that money is specifically earmarked for developing infrastructure and civic amenities within the urban areas. So the penalty paid for past violations theoretically funds future improvements.
Right, makes sense. One last point on process. If someone disagrees with a decision made by the commissioner, say their building permission is refused or an order is issued they think is unfair, is there any way to challenge that? Is there an appeal process?
Yes, absolutely. It's not just a one-way street. This connects back to that idea of transparency and fairness. Decisions made by the commissioner regarding building permissions, refusals, orders, etc., can be appealed. The appeal goes to the Chief Commissioner of the Greater Bengaluru Authority, the GBA. There's a time limit, though. You generally have to file the appeal within 30 days of receiving the commissioner's decision.
And is the GBA Chief Commissioner's decision final? How long does that take?
According to the Act, the Chief Commissioner's decision is final. There's no further appeal specified within this framework. And they're supposed to make that final decision within 90 days of receiving the appeal. So this appeal process provides a crucial layer of review, a check on the initial decision-making, which is important when you're dealing with complex regulations and potentially high stakes for builders and homeowners. It aims to prevent arbitrary decisions. So when you pull it all together, what's truly fascinating here, I think, is how all these different pieces, the detailed bylaws, the certificates, the fees, the strict enforcement, even the limited regularization and the appeal process, they collectively aim to create a more structured, predictable, safer, and ultimately a more livable urban environment for everyone in Greater Bengaluru. The various fees and penalties, they aren't just punitive, are they? They're also a mechanism designed to fund those essential civic improvements, trying to ensure that development contributes positively and is sustainable in the long run. It really feels like an attempt at a holistic approach to city planning.
So what does this all mean for you living in or observing Bengaluru? These Greater Bengaluru Building Regulations 2024, they really represent a massive comprehensive effort to formalize and streamline urban development in a city that desperately needs it. As you navigate the city, maybe start considering the visible and invisible impact of these rules. Look at the height of that new apartment building. Think about the mandatory rainwater harvesting system, hopefully on its roof, or even notice the subtle widening of a road that might ease traffic flow eventually. The real question to ponder, maybe, is how do you think such a detailed and, let's be honest, quite stringent framework will actually shape the future growth, the character, and the sustainability of one of India's fastest growing, most dynamic cities? Lots to think about there. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.